The tension in the chamber was thick enough to cut with a knife. The bright lights of the committee room reflected off the polished oak tables, illuminating the severe expressions of those in attendance. Cameras were positioned in every corner, broadcasting the hearing live to millions of viewers across the country. This was no ordinary congressional debate. This was a political showdown that had been brewing for months, one that had the potential to explode into something much bigger. At the center of it all sat Pam Bondi, the U.S. Attorney General, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her gaze sharp and unwavering. She was a seasoned prosecutor, a woman who had built her career on putting criminals behind bars, and now she was leading the charge against a growing crisis that was tearing through American cities like wildfire. Violent gangs formed by illegal immigrants. Across from her, seated on the opposite side of the long wooden table, was Congressman David Reyes, a well-known Democratic representative from California. Reyes was as fiery as he was controversial, a man whose district had been both a beacon for immigration and a hotspot for organized crime. He had spent years championing the rights of undocumented immigrants, but today, his position was under fire. For weeks, reports had surfaced about a brutal wave of violence sweeping through cities, with law enforcement agencies pointing to ruthless gangs made up largely of illegal immigrants. The numbers were staggering: murders, human trafficking, extortion rings, all orchestrated by foreign-born criminals who had slipped through the cracks of the system. And yet, Reyes and his allies insisted on a more compassionate approach, arguing that sweeping deportations and harsh prison sentences were inhumane and unconstitutional. Pam Bondi was having none of it. She adjusted the microphone before her and took a deep breath, scanning the crowded room. There were journalists, activists, and even a few victims' families in attendance. She knew this hearing would be brutal, emotional, and, most of all, political. "Congressman Reyes," she began, her voice measured but firm, "you and I both know why we're here today. Crime is spiraling out of control. Innocent people are being slaughtered in the streets, businesses are being extorted, and families are living in terror. My office has prosecuted hundreds of cases involving gangs like Los Sangres, MS-13, and the Black Vultures, all organizations that recruit illegal immigrants and turn them into violent criminals. And yet, instead of supporting law enforcement efforts to crack down on these gangs, you and your colleagues have done nothing but stand in the way." Reyes scoffed, shaking his head as he leaned into his microphone. "Attorney General Bondi, with all due respect, your rhetoric is fear-mongering at its worst. These so-called immigrant gangs you keep mentioning," he made air quotes with his fingers, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "are nothing more than a small fraction of the larger crime problem in America. And let's be honest here, Pam, the real reason you're pushing this narrative is to justify your administration's cruel deportation policies." Pam's jaw tightened. She had been expecting this line of attack. "I don't deal in narratives, Congressman," she shot back. "I deal in facts. And the facts tell us that these gangs are not just a small fraction of the problem. They are the problem. Just last week, a young girl in Baltimore was found in an alley, her body mutilated beyond recognition, a victim of an MS-13 initiation ritual. In Texas, a family of 5 was executed in their home because the father refused to pay protection money to the Black Vultures. In my home state of Florida, we've seen cases of human trafficking rings operated exclusively by foreign-born criminals, some of whom were deported multiple times but kept sneaking back in because of our broken border policies." The room was silent, except for the rapid clicking of journalists typing on their laptops. Reyes, however, remained unfazed. He folded his hands together and let out a slow breath. "So what do you propose, Pam? You want to round up every undocumented immigrant and throw them in jail? Ship them off like cargo?" Pam's blue eyes locked onto his. "I want justice," she said coldly. "I want these monsters behind bars, and I want them out of this country for good. We have the ability to track, arrest, and deport every single gang member operating in our cities, but every time we try to take action, we're blocked by politicians like you, who care more about appeasing activists than protecting American lives." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Reyes clenched his fists. "You think this is just about criminals?" he snapped. "You're painting with a broad, dangerous brush. You want to deport gang members? Fine. But you and I both know that what your policies really do is target entire immigrant communities. You send in ICE agents to raid neighborhoods, you tear families apart, and for what? To score political points." Pam's nostrils flared. Are you really going to sit there and tell me that a severed head found in a dumpster is just a political talking point? The room fell into a stunned silence. Reyes's face darkened, but before he could reply, Pam continued. Let me ask you something, Congressman. If you had a daughter walking home from school, and she was kidnapped by one of these criminals, dragged into a warehouse, tortured, and left in pieces for the police to find, would you still be sitting here telling me I'm fear-mongering? Reyes's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Pam leaned forward, her voice now softer, but laced with ice. Because that's what's happening. Right now. To real families. To real American citizens. And instead of standing up for them, you're standing up for the people who are butchering them. The tension was unbearable. The audience sat frozen, waiting for Reyes's response. He finally spoke, but his voice was quieter, controlled. You can paint me as the villain all you want, Pam. But I refuse to demonize an entire group of people because of a few bad actors. Pam shook her head slowly. It's not a few bad actors, Congressman. It's a network of killers. And every time we fail to act, more people die. Silence. Reyes shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie. I guess we'll see what the American people think when they hear this debate. Pam smirked, folding her hands. Yes. We will. The hearing was far from over. And neither side was backing down. The hearing room felt hotter, though the air conditioning was on full blast. Pam Bondi could see the beads of sweat forming on Congressman Reyes's forehead, though he hid his discomfort well. The cameras were rolling, catching every word, every flicker of emotion. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a battle for public opinion. Pam had spent years in courtrooms, breaking down criminals with the sheer force of logic, facts, and unshakable resolve. But this was something else. This wasn't just about the law. This was about perception. Reyes wasn't just defending illegal immigrants. He was twisting the argument, making it look like she was the one who lacked compassion. She knew the stakes were higher than ever. If she lost this argument in the public eye, the administration would lose support for its crackdown on these gangs. If Reyes won, more people would die. She couldn't let that happen. Reyes finally spoke again, his voice calm but insistent. Attorney General Bondi, we're all here because we want to stop crime. But I refuse to accept that your solution, mass deportation and sweeping crackdowns, is the only way. Our justice system is built on due process, not rounding people up like animals. I've met kids in my district, young boys who were recruited into gangs before they even knew what they were doing. These children, yes, children, are being forced into a life of crime because they have no other options. And instead of offering them a way out, you want to lock them up or kick them out of the country. Pam exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. This was the argument she had expected. Congressman, she began, her voice smooth but cutting, let's talk about these children you're so concerned about. Do you know what MS-13 calls their new recruits? Soldiers. You think they're kids? They're trained killers. We've seen 14-year-olds hacking people apart with machetes. We've arrested teenagers who laughed while carving gang symbols into their victims. These aren't kids making bad choices. They are murderers in the making. Reyes narrowed his eyes. So your solution is to treat them all like hardened criminals? Pam nodded. If they act like criminals, yes. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some were nodding in agreement, others looked appalled. Pam pressed forward, her voice sharper now. Let me be clear. I don't want to deport good people. I don't want to break up families. But we have to stop pretending that these gangs aren't a growing cancer in our country. And you, Congressman Reyes, are protecting that cancer. Reyes scoffed. That's ridiculous. I'm protecting innocent immigrants from being scapegoated. Innocent? Pam interrupted, her eyes flashing. Tell that to Maria Gonzalez, whose 16-year-old daughter was kidnapped outside her school and sold to a cartel. Tell that to David Morrison, a shop owner in Texas who was shot execution-style for refusing to pay gang protection money. You say I'm using fear, but I'm talking about real people. Reyes opened his mouth, but Pam wasn't finished. You want to talk about kids, she continued, her voice rising. How about Emily Waters, a 10-year-old girl from Virginia, who was playing in her front yard when a stray bullet from a gang drive-by tore through her chest. Do you want to know who pulled the trigger? An 18-year-old MS-13 recruit, someone who entered the country illegally just 2 years ago. The silence in the room was deafening. Even Reyes looked momentarily shaken. Pam leaned in. You think these are isolated cases? They're not. We have entire neighborhoods living in fear because they know these gangs don't just target rival criminals. They target ordinary people. They extort business owners, they traffic young girls, they kill anyone who gets in their way. And you want to protect them. Reyes clenched his jaw. That is not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying, Congressman? Pam shot back. Because every time we try to remove these gang members, people like you stand in the way. You call it inhumane. You call it unconstitutional. But what's really inhumane is allowing this violence to continue. Reyes took a slow breath. His voice was steadier now, though his eyes betrayed his frustration. Pam, if you think mass deportations are going to solve this problem, you're delusional. These gangs don't just exist in the U.S., they exist in Mexico, in El Salvador, in Guatemala. They're international. If we deport them, they'll just keep coming back. Pam exhaled sharply. Then secure the border. Make it so they can't come back. You think I don't know these gangs are global? I do. But we can't keep letting them thrive here. Reyes shook his head. And what about the innocent immigrants caught in your crackdown? The ones who aren't criminals? Are you willing to accept that collateral damage? Pam hesitated for only a second. If it means protecting American lives? Yes. Gasps filled the room. Reyes's eyes widened. So you admit it? You'd rather punish innocent people just to get rid of the guilty? Pam's voice was ice. I'd rather protect Americans from being butchered in the streets. The tension was unbearable. For the first time, Reyes had no immediate response. The cameras zoomed in on his face. He knew what had just happened. Pam Bondi had forced him into a corner. If he pushed back too hard, he'd look like he was defending gang members. If he backed down, he'd look weak on crime. Pam saw it in his face. She had him. But she also knew this wasn't over. Reyes wasn't the type to stay down for long. He was planning something. And whatever it was, it would be brutal. The hearing had descended into a war of words, and neither side was backing down. Pam Bondi sat firm, unwavering, watching Congressman David Reyes struggle to regain his footing after her last devastating blow. She could see the wheels turning in his head, his mind calculating his next move. He had been on the defensive, forced to justify his position, but Pam knew better than to underestimate him. He was dangerous when cornered. Reyes took a slow sip of water, then set the glass down carefully. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, too calm. Attorney General Bondi, he said, leaning forward, I have to admit, you're a talented prosecutor. You paint a terrifying picture of crime in this country, of monsters lurking in the shadows, preying on innocent Americans. But there's something you're conveniently leaving out. Pam narrowed her eyes. Reyes looked directly into the cameras. This wasn't for her, this was for the audience at home. You claim that illegal immigrants are responsible for a surge in crime. But let's talk about the numbers. According to multiple studies, undocumented immigrants actually commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens. Your entire argument is based on fear, not facts. Pam felt her blood heat. He was twisting the truth. She kept her voice even, but her words came out like sharpened steel. Congressman, let's not cherry-pick statistics. We're not talking about all undocumented immigrants. We're talking about gangs. Organized crime. She tapped the table twice for emphasis. MS-13 isn't a myth. The black vultures aren't a fabrication. These groups exist, and they are disproportionately made up of illegal immigrants who entered this country unlawfully. Reyes smirked, shaking his head. Pam, I expected better from you. You're deliberately misleading the American people. Crime is crime. It doesn't matter where the perpetrators come from. Pam leaned forward, her voice low but lethal. It matters when we could have prevented it. When people shouldn't have been here in the first place. Reyes let out a small laugh, shaking his head. So let me get this straight. Every American citizen who commits a crime is just an unfortunate part of society, but when an undocumented immigrant does it, suddenly it's proof that the entire system is failing. Pam's jaw tightened. I'm saying that when an illegal immigrant murders an innocent citizen, that crime should have never happened. Because that person should have never been in this country. Reyes didn't flinch, but Pam could tell she had struck a nerve. But then he pulled out his trump card. You know, Pam, he said, his tone almost conversational, if this is really about protecting Americans, I wonder why you're so focused on gangs made up of illegal immigrants, but you say nothing about domestic terrorist groups, white supremacist militias, and American-born mass shooters. Pam knew where he was going, and she refused to let him control the conversation. Those criminals belong in prison too, she said firmly. But that's not what we're here to discuss today, is it? This hearing is about violent immigrant gangs, the ones you keep defending. Reyes pounced on that word. I'm defending the Constitution, Pam, he shot back. You're the one arguing for a police state. You want to send armed agents into immigrant communities, round people up based on suspicion, and ship them out. That's not justice, that's authoritarianism. Pam could see some members of the audience nodding. Reyes was playing the optics game. He wasn't arguing facts anymore. He was framing her as a ruthless enforcer, a government agent who didn't care about civil rights. She needed to turn the tide. Fast. You call it authoritarianism, she said, her voice razor-sharp, but I call it saving lives. Because while you sit here making speeches about fairness, real people are being butchered. And you want to talk about civil rights. Pam's voice rose now, charged with fury. Where were these civil rights when a mother in New York had to identify her 14-year-old son's body after he was hacked apart with machetes? Where was due process when a father in Texas was forced to watch his wife and daughter executed in front of him before being shot in the head? Where was justice when an 8-year-old girl was found stuffed into a suitcase, dumped in a river by cartel operatives? The room was silent. Reyes looked shaken. Pam pressed on. These gangs aren't random criminals. They're butchers, murderers, rapists, human traffickers. And every time we try to remove them, you and your party block us. Reyes cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. Pam, I'm not saying we should ignore crime. But you are, she cut him off. You oppose every measure we've proposed. You oppose harsher sentencing. You oppose deportation. You oppose ICE raids. You want to let these gangs keep growing. Reyes looked trapped, but he wasn't out yet. He played his final card. You're right, Pam, he said, his voice soft but deliberate. There is violence. There is crime. But tell me, how do you think these gangs exist in the first place? Pam frowned. Because we allow them to enter our country. Reyes smiled slightly, shaking his head. No, Pam. Because we fund them. Pam's heart skipped a beat. Reyes continued, his voice slow and deliberate. These gangs get their power from American demand for drugs, American money flowing through cartel operations, American gun manufacturers selling weapons that end up in their hands. So you can talk all day about deportation, but until we take responsibility for our role in this crisis, nothing will change. Pam clenched her jaw. She hated that he had a point. He could see her hesitation and seized the moment. You think you're fighting crime, but all you're doing is treating the symptoms, not the disease. Deport them today, and there'll be a new batch of recruits tomorrow. You want a real solution? Look at who's supplying them. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. For the first time, Pam didn't have an immediate response. Reyes had managed to flip the argument. The hearing wasn't over. But now, the fight had changed. Pam Bondi wasn't just battling Reyes anymore. She was battling something much bigger. Pam Bondi had spent years in the courtroom dismantling criminals on the stand, exposing their lies, and ensuring justice was served. But this was different. Congressman David Reyes wasn't just fighting her. He was fighting the entire narrative. And the way the cameras lingered on him told her he was winning the PR war. Reyes had managed to do something most politicians couldn't. He turned the argument around. He wasn't just arguing against deportations or ICE crackdowns anymore. He was putting the blame on America itself. Pam couldn't let that stand. She took a deep breath, sat forward, and in a calm but deadly voice, she said, "Congressman Reyes, I see what you're doing. You're trying to shift the blame, make this look like an American-made crisis instead of what it really is, a failure to enforce our laws." Reyes didn't flinch. "It is an American-made crisis, Pam. You want to deport these criminals, but let's be honest, they'll be back. The cartels will keep smuggling them in. We send them out, and they find a way back because we have a broken border. That's the real issue. Instead of arguing over deportations, why don't we address the root cause?" Pam smirked. "Oh, I agree we need to fix the border, Congressman. But let's be clear about something. You fought against every border security measure we've tried to implement. You've called walls racist, you've voted against additional funding for Border Patrol, and your party has sued to stop deportation flights. So don't sit there and pretend you want to stop this when you're the reason it's happening." Reyes exhaled through his nose, his jaw tight. He was feeling the heat now. "You know, Pam," he said, his voice lowering, "you like to paint this as a simple problem. Bad guys here illegally, kick them out, problem solved. But that's not reality. These gangs exist because of poverty, because of lack of opportunity, because of corruption. Deporting them won't make them disappear." Pam folded her hands together, her voice sharp as a blade. "No, Congressman. But it will keep them from murdering innocent Americans." Silence. Reyes swallowed hard. He was losing control. Pam didn't stop. "Look at the families in this room." She gestured to the people behind her, many of them victims of gang violence. Tears lined their eyes. Grief twisted their faces. They don't care about your political games. They care about the fact that their children were slaughtered. And all they hear from you is excuses. A heavy weight settled in the room. Reyes knew he had lost. Finally, he let out a sigh and sat back in his chair. "We need solutions, Pam. Not just punishments." Pam leaned in one last time. "You're right," she said. "And the first step to a real solution. Stop protecting the criminals." The hearing ended in chaos, reporters shouting, protesters screaming, politicians scrambling for control. But Pam Bondi didn't care. She had done what she came to do. And she knew the American people had heard the truth.